In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Welcome to the first video of a 9-part series on joy and the theology of joy. I'm hoping this will be a beneficial series. We won't really go into much of the meat today, or at least in this video right now. More just kind of an introductory um, presentation here. So we'll just kind of start by giving some background as to where this series comes from. So this book here shown on the right is actually a book that my wife and I published together, uh, and we gave to all the guests at our wedding. This was the favorite at our wedding. Um, I'm in the process of rewriting it, and this is actually the title here at the bottom. This is the new title, and the way that the book it's pretty much broken down into 3 parts: the theology of joy, the theology of marriage, and then uh, a historic look at the wedding of Cana and what the early church fathers had to say about wedding receptions. So the theology of joy is really intended to be like a standalone topic. Joy, of course, is a topic that affects everybody in every part and every facet of our lives. Understanding the difference between happiness and pleasure and joy, and what our underlying motives are in life and pursuing these things. So the way we're going to kind of go about this series is we have this 9-part series on just the theology of joy, which is going to be based on this book that we published. Some of the details may be not in the book, but they will be captured in the next in this new title that I put here on the bottom. And I just didn't want to wait until finalizing the new book before putting out the YouTube videos, in case this is of value or benefit to anybody. Um, And I guess kind of just some things worth mentioning in terms of the method. I'm going to rely very heavily on early church fathers, and of course I'll try to bridge and kind of highlight what the early church taught, and the same teaching which continues to uh, be taught and promulgated in the church today. Of course, I'm going to be talking from a Coptic Orthodox perspective. However, in certain areas, maybe in some of the other series, I do some more comparative theology between different churches, but maybe not so much here in the theology of joy. And so pretty much this is what we're going to be, all 9 parts of this series will be on this first part, just the theology of joy. And the reason that the book is really broken down into the parts that it is I think this illustration kind of captures that pretty well, is here in the top left. Let me see if I have a little cursor. Oh, nice. Top left, St. Augustine talks about that there's 2 causes that lead to sin. Either we do not know our duty, or we do not perform the duty that we know. It's either the sin of ignorance or the sin of weakness. St. Clement says something very similar, that we're either unable to determine what we ought to do or what ought to be done, or that we're unable to do it. So the idea of talking about wedding receptions, the underlying part of it is we had to really kind of unpack what farah is. The Arabic word for weddings is farah, or in English, joy. So I figured joy would be a very appropriate topic. And then, of course, we have to talk about what the theology of marriage is. And then once we have that foundation, then I think we know what our duty. It should be very easy to determine what our duty is in terms of um, an appropriate means of celebrating a wedding reception. So then part 3, after having that foundation, then we can talk about what all the early church fathers have taught about wedding receptions. And it should be pretty easy to do that once we have this foundation. And it's probably worth mentioning that, maybe you coming on to this YouTube series, maybe you don't care at all about weddings or marriage. And that's perfectly okay. Perhaps you're only interested in joy, and that's perfectly acceptable. But if you are interested in this topic, um, then if you're interested in wedding receptions, I highly encourage you to begin here with the theology of joy, move on to the next YouTube series that we'll have about the theology of marriage. And then lastly, work your way to part 3, which is the wedding receptions. And then, we also added a part 4, just frequently asked questions for the YouTube series. Um, but it's also worth mentioning that what we're doing here is kind of just trying to identify right from wrong and have a good basis, both biblical, patristic, with church rights, in terms of identifying and learning at the feet of our fathers, right from wrong. However, that tells us what our duty is, but it doesn't give us the strength or the ability to actually perform the duty that we will learn ought to be performed. So that's the reason I put the ultimate foundation to all of this is really a willingness to submit to God and a desire to do so, and ultimately coming to Him with our weaknesses and asking for His grace to provide us His strength and His grace in order to perform the duties that we will learn about. So I think that's really the most important part, and that's really something that can't just be transmitted through a YouTube video. But that is kind of the underlying basis for everything that will allow everything that we discuss to be actualized in real life. So for the rest of this introduction, I'm gonna give a little bit more background to what inspired doing this work on wedding receptions. And for the rest of the series on joy itself, I'll be using a lot of examples that relate more closely to weddings. However, once again, if you're not actually interested in the topic of marriage or weddings, then the Theology of Joy is a perfectly acceptable standalone series, which I hope will be of benefit to someone. So this is kind of the starting point. That marriage is supposed to be an image or an icon of the relationship between Christ and the church. As St. John Chrysostom tells us, marriage is an image of the presence of Christ. Um, and St. Clement of Alexandria as well, that marriage is more than human, it's a miniature kingdom. So if this is true, which we take it to be so, and marriage truly is intended to be an icon or image of the relationship between Christ and the church, then one can very reasonably expect that the wedding reception, the means by which this sacrament is being celebrated, also looks like the way that Christ would celebrate with his wife. It should be, one should see Christ, the joy of Christ, front and center when celebrating such a holy sacrament. So the goal is not really to say that um, anybody or anything is wrong. It's not to condemn anybody or anything. Um, I would be the first to be condemned if that was the approach that was used in anything in life. But the goal is really just to highlight what would be well-pleasing to Christ, what would make his manifest presence with us in wedding receptions, what would start off a marriage on a holy footing with him being front and center, glorifying and blessing this union that he has established and accomplished. And that's really the objective. And I think actually this topic is going to be pretty helpful if you're just interested in joy alone, because it'll give us a pretty good example of how to differentiate between happiness and pleasures versus joy as used in a biblical and patristic sense. Oftentimes, unfortunately, wedding receptions very closely resemble like nightclubs, to be honest. In fact, if you took videos of various clips from a nightclub and put it side by side with various clips from your typical wedding reception, you'll likely find them to be almost indistinguishable. And perhaps even the wedding receptions at times would be more boisterous or more, um, more revelrous than nightclubs. I actually, interestingly, did this exercise, so I'm going to show it with you here on the next slide. So I'll mute this one.
ازاي؟ لا مش قادر امشي.
So clearly, the means of celebration at I guess a typical nightclub versus the typical or very standard wedding reception festivities are almost indistinguishable. They're very closely paralleled. The types of festivities are very, very similar. And actually, not too long ago, in the college class that I served, the St. Bishoy Fellowship at St. Mary's, I put out a questionnaire to a bunch of college youth, and I asked the question, have you ever been scandalized at a wedding? And if so, what happened? And these were some of the results that I heard back. So actually, one of the most interesting things is I got a lot of responses. This was a Google form. I got a bunch of answers, and I actually sat down with a lot of the youth and I asked them, would you be willing to have me interview you on this and post it on YouTube? And a lot of folks were okay with that, and we actually went through with it and we interviewed them. And I was planning to share those videos, but something very interesting happened. Within a week or two of probably more than half of the interviews, the people that I interviewed would actually come back and ask me not to share the video. And I would say, yes, of course, I'm not going to share a video of you against your will if you're not comfortable. But if you don't mind my asking, what changed? What made you uncomfortable with me sharing this video? And most folks were afraid that they were going to offend a loved one. They were afraid that somebody close to them, whether it be a friend or a family member, um, may see them and may hear their comments about wedding receptions and get upset with them, and it may hurt that relationship for them. And I thought that that was actually more insightful than the very words that they said in their interviews. The fact that more than half the folks that we interviewed came back with a very similar concern, I thought was a very insightful piece of information that it indicated um, how how much this issue has penetrated, you know, the culture or the folks that um, attend weddings. So yeah, most folks didn't want to have what they said. They didn't want their videos on. However, they were okay with me sharing what they said anonymously. So I'm going to take certain quotes from a couple of the interviews and just go through them pretty quickly, just to give us an idea of some of the issues that the youth have seen um, when they've attended weddings that look pretty much like nightclubs. So one person says at a wedding reception, I overheard some of the servers or the waiters talking. There was drinking and dancing, and they were laughing and making fun of our church and our faith. For these two servers, it may be the only time they encounter the church. So this individual heard some non-Orthodox folks who were working at the venue that they attended making fun of the church because of all the drinking and dancing, and that was the only, I guess, interaction that they had with our church. Someone else says, this is someone in college, but they said that I was scandalized a lot with social media. It was very tough for me as a high schooler, they're talking about when they were in high school, to understand how my servants would be celebrating a sacrament in this way. And it was hard to understand how there's a standard put for us in the way we're supposed to act as Christians, but it didn't make sense or align how my servants or my role models were acting this way. So in this case, we had somebody observing behaviors that were inconsistent with the values being instilled in them at church. And the vessel by which they were exposed to that was, it seems to have been by social media, something that, quite frankly, you can't really get away from. Especially at events that are public, like wedding receptions. There's always going to be a camera out. Somebody's posting, a reel or something of everything that happens. Let's look at another one. This individual said, "You see people with very strong principles who don't usually conduct themselves in a certain manner, whether it be dancing or drinking or whatever the other events that happen at weddings. But to please their friends and to please their parents, they conform. And they have a very stereotypical wedding, doing things that they would never normally do if it was completely up to them. So I think the pressure that our parents put on us and our friends put on us, and that this culture puts on us, for people who have very strong principles to go against them just to conform to the societal pressures of how weddings are supposed to look like, really stumbles me a lot." So this person actually is now highlighting a lot of points that, um, of course, are very problematic. The pressures that are placed on us by loved ones. I mean, the very fact that a lot of folks didn't want their videos posted, um, it speaks volumes about how this topic is perceived. So hopefully, I hope I don't make any enemies by going through these series in this book. We're gonna look at just one more comment from someone in college. This is my favorite one. I thought it was the best. He says, this young man says, "If I go on record saying what I actually think, then I'll never get married." That's kind of hilarious, but also kind of really sad. It's really suggesting that a prospective spouse would could potentially be turned off by someone who feels that the the typical method of celebrating wedding receptions is inappropriate. So I think that speaks volumes. We had a good laugh about that, but it is a kind of a sad reality. Before we go through the theology of joy, and we actually go through the series itself, it is worth mentioning beforehand that I'm going to draw from a lot of early church fathers. St. Augustine, in particular, it seems like he wrote a bit more than most of the other fathers on the topic of happiness and joy. So naturally, I'm going to draw from him a bit more. Um, I just I thought it was worth highlighting that St. Augustine is a great saint venerated in the Coptic Orthodox Church on the 22nd day of the blessed month of Misor, which very interestingly actually is my wedding anniversary. Um, my wife and I had a liturgy wedding, so we got married between matins and the selection of the lamb before liturgy begins, and then in the wedding itself, we actually had his name is Father Augustine, actually read the Synaxar uh, when he read the reading about Saint Augustine. So I thought that was a pretty neat thing to happen, which was very special for my wife and I as well. Also, if I ever happen to forget my wedding anniversary, all I have to do is remember that it's on the 22nd of the blessed month of Misor, which is a feast of Saint Augustine. So
And today is that
and pretty much here, just this is the breakdown of the whole series on the theology of joy. So this is kind of what we're going to cover. Every video will be dedicated to one individual topic. These are the section breakdowns of the theology of joy. So we'll start with some insights from creation on purpose. What is the purpose of human life? Joy and worship. Kind of what was God's model for these things. Then we'll talk about how to model joy, happiness, and pleasure. We want a way to kind of a framework in which to understand these three things. Then, of course, we want to talk about how to attain joy. That's kind of uh, a pretty big deal. If we're going to talk about joy, let's acquire it. Then we'll talk about, after we discuss that, next section will be, are there any alternative paths to acquiring joy? Next, we'll talk about what to do if you want to make sure and guarantee that you're never joyful. You know, what not to do. After that, we'll talk about what I call the neutral swing states of joy. certain things that can go in either direction. They can either make you joyful or not joyful, based on how they're used. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about what happens when worldly happiness and pleasure are pursued in place of godly joy. What are the ramifications? What will come out of that if that type of mistake is made? And what can you expect will be the results? So, this is the introductory video. Then we have these 7 sections, and then at the very end we'll also have an interview with our dear Father Abraham Wasif. So that will be the 9th part of the series on joy. And then we'll kind of follow a similar format for the other parts. Part 2 is the theology of marriage. Part 3 will be about the actual wedding receptions. And then the 4th part will be just the frequently asked questions. So with that being said, I hope this is something that you're interested in. I hope that we can go through this journey together, and I pray and I hope that we can grow through it together. And hopefully we'll see you in the coming sections. Glory be to God forever. Amen.